Okay, so I'm going to do a build on Harpie 180. This is what we're working with right here. Harpie 180. I got one already unboxed. I'm going to do a build and just talk a little bit about the choices that I like to make when I put together a quad. So normally, the first thing I would do when I start a build is I would go ahead and take a set of files and under running water in a sink. I do it in my laundry room, but it doesn't really matter. I would go through and actually file all the edges and all the slots and all the holes, right, in order to get a nice, smooth, clean, clean edge. So I'd basically just go like that around each one of these edges and these straightaways. However, the Quad Monster frames already come pre-cleaned and smoothed out, so I don't really feel the necessity to do it on these. However, if you do want to get even stronger radius or something, you can go ahead and do that before you start your build up. These parts are nice and clean, not sharp at all, so I'm just going to go ahead and work with them as they are. Now, the very first thing that I like to do when I'm working building a quad is put together the motors and the speed controllers. So I got my speed controllers here. There's 4 of them, and I have my motors here as well. One of them already been pulled out of the bag. You see very long wires on these motors. Okay. What I'm going to do first is program my speed controllers. Now, I did these beforehand. I updated them to the most recent version of BL Heli, and what I have done is I've actually made 2 of them reverse turning. That way I can solder everything in the same orientation, and I will end up with everything turning in the right direction. I just need to figure out which goes where before I attach them to my frame. So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the heat shrink on all of these because I like to do direct solder. But if you don't like to do direct solder, that's fine. You can trim these wires a little bit and just solder wire to wire. I will remove the heat shrink and direct solder straight to the pads on the speed controller. Again, if you're not comfortable doing that, don't. Just go ahead and do solder wire to wire, or you can even solder bullet connectors as supplied onto the wires and connect them that way. That is really your choice. Okay? Alright, so let me get started with that first. Alright, heat shrink has been removed. Time to desolder some wires. Wires have been removed from the speed controllers. Here we have 4 speed controllers without wires. Next, let's take a look at the motors. So here's my 4 motors. The first thing I want to see is if I have all clockwise threaded or if any of these are counterclockwise. Well, it turns out that they do matter, right? So I'm going to have to go ahead and solder them up to a speed controller and then determine if they're spinning the right direction or not. So you can actually see on these particular ones marked onto the motor, it says clockwise and counterclockwise. So let me go ahead and take my frame and do a quick layout to determine how far I can go with my speed controllers. So I want my speed controllers roughly at this position, so roughly in the middle of the arm. That'll help me determine more or less where I want to cut my motor wires to get them right there. So yeah, I'd say about 3/8 to a 1/2 inch. And so let me go ahead and cut my motor wires to that particular length. Okay, wires are cut. Now all I gotta do is strip the ends and then tin them. Motors are tinned. Time to join them to the speed controllers. Alright, so this is what we're looking for. Alright, motor joined to the speed controller. Let me do the other 3. So I have 4 motors of speed controllers soldered up and ready to go. Before I go ahead and mount them on my frame, I'm going to go ahead and make sure they're all spinning in the right direction. Now, since these come as a clockwise and counterclockwise pair, there's a really easy way to do this, right? I'll hook them up to my receiver or to a servo tester, and I will go ahead and take this nut and leave it threaded on halfway, loose in other words, not tight. If the nut flies off when the motor starts, that means it's spinning in the wrong direction. If the nut tightens in, that means that the motor is spinning in the right direction. So let's go ahead and get my stuff and do that. I have a battery, I have a servo tester, I have power for the servo tester, it's a little 2-cell battery, and I have a little harness with alligator clips that I'm going to use to hook up to the speed controller. So I'll go ahead and just plug this in right here, like so. And I have a little device here that current limits. It's a little light bulb hooked up in series, and that will stop me from smoking anything if I hook something up backwards, right? So I'll go ahead and plug in my signal into the servo tester in the orientation it provides. Go ahead and feed the servo tester with power. You see the lights on. Power to the speed controller. And hear those beeps. And let's go ahead and spin it up. So, this tightened the nut. That means that this motor is spinning in the right direction. In other words, it's spinning this way. Yes, and I can feel it's spinning in the right direction. 1 done. Let's do the other 3. Huh. Okay, so as you saw when I tested this, the nut came off. That means that this speed controller needs to be reversed. So I'll hook that up to my computer in a second and I'll reverse the direction of rotation. Well, as expected, my 4th one did the same thing. Since 2 of my speed controllers were pre-reversed, I lucked out. 50-50 chance. That's about par for the course. Alrighty, let's get the computer out and get this fixed. I've updated the rotation and direction. Let's go ahead and test them again. Alright, that tightened. Perfect. Alright, so that's the last one. We have 4 speed controllers that are spinning in the right direction. Okay? Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to prep them to mount to the frame. Okay, so in my case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim down these wires. The single wires I'm going to cut a little short because I'm going to put single pins. And in my particular case, I like to remove the ground wire because ground wire is just redundant otherwise, right? Also, once that's done, I'm going to mount them to the frame. Now I need to make sure that they're spinning in the right direction and I mount them to the right corner, right? Now, if you have nuts that don't go each way, you still need to make sure that they mount to the right corner based on the direction of rotation that you have programmed into your speed controller. Okay? Alright, so let me get started with that. I've wound all my wires. Time to desolder the black signal wire. Alright, I've removed all the bolts that come with the motor, and what you'll notice when you open up these little bolt bags is that there are actually 2 different lengths. You'll have shorter bolts and you have longer bolts. And what's going to determine which ones you're going to use is the thickness of your frame. Now the Harpie is a 3mm frame. As I feed these, I'll notice that there is not a lot of bolt left over with the short bolts, right? In my opinion, that's too little. What we want to do is we want to find the right length of bolt to get a good bite, but it can't go so far that it's going to get in the windings. Well, the long bolt is the right one. The long bolt does not get into the windings even if I feed it all the way through. So I will pull out of this bunch of bolts I got going here all 4 of the long ones. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, let's save the other ones. They can always come in handy later. So this is a clockwise motor. It's going to be front left or rear right. Let me start with front left. And I like to use Loctite on my bolts to make sure that they do not come off. So just find the right location. Little drop of Loctite. I do not tighten the first bolt until I get some more in position so that I don't mount the motor crooked and then can't get the remaining bolts in. So let's do the other 3. Okay, I want these firm but not over tight because I do not want to strip the threads. Of course, I mounted my first motor and I forgot something fairly critical. It's much easier to heat shrink your speed controllers again when they're off the frame than when they're on. So I'm going to go ahead and heat shrink these speed controllers, and I'll heat shrink the last one on the frame right now because, well, it doesn't hurt. It's just easier if I do it off the frame. Alright, 4 motors zip tied. Let's finish mounting them. So, I like to mount the opposite motors first. That way I won't accidentally mount the motor in the wrong location. Alright. Okay, motors are mounted to the frame. Time to solder them up to the power distribution board. So the next step is going to be to mount the power distribution board. I'm going to use these nylon screws. And these nylon standoffs. The standoffs will be used to attach to the screws and then to hold the power distribution board down. Before I do that, however, I want to pre-tin all my pads. So I want to make sure that I got solder on all the pads so that when it comes down to actually soldering onto it, all I need to do is reheat and reflow. So let me start with doing that. Power distribution board is soldered. I'm going to clean up some of the excess flux and then I'll mount it to the frame. So I find that I can tighten these screws and these bolts by hand and I get a tight enough fit, but if you need to, you just use a Phillips head screw here and a 5.5 millimeter wrench or socket driver on the other side, and that'll work too. Okay? Alright, so next I'm going to mount the power distribution board. Now when I mount the power distribution board, I need to make sure if this is the front of the quad on this side, and this is the bottom of the quad on this side, or the rear of the quad, sorry, back, front, I need to make sure that the pads that say battery on them that's the two big ones, face the rear of the quad. So I'm going to mount that down here towards the large holes where there's two of them. So it just slides right in there. Make sure none of my wires are caught, and tighten it down with more of these standoffs. Does it look like this? Alright, power distribution board is mounted. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is solder the power wires on my speed controllers. Alright, so we'll get signal wires out of the way. And each one of the power wires are going to go to the side. Now before I actually do that, in order to get the right length, I am going to go ahead and fix my speed controllers to the frame. The way I'll do that is within your frame package, we provide a wrap strap. Now you can do it any way you want, but in my case I will be using the wrap strap. Wrap strap is this guy here. Works in the following fashion. It's kind of like a zip tie in essence, right? So I'll put my frame over so I can work a little bit more easily. I'll go ahead and I'll take and I'll feed it right through the very last hole in the wrap strap, and I'll just get this nice and tight until it's holding the speed controller in the position that I want. Alright. I'll go right down the middle of the speed controller, and that's about right there. I could always pull it tight a little bit more if I want to. So just make sure that I'm locked in properly, and then once I'm in position, like so, I'll just go ahead and trim these off with my nippers. Alright, just like a flexible rubberized zip tie. Alright, there it is, mounted. Now I'll go ahead and do the other three. Okay, the wrap strap will be enough to do all your 4 speed controllers, and you should have a little bit left over in case you mess one up. Now that my speed controllers are in the right position, I can measure my wire length and cut it to where I need to solder it to the pads. Alright, welcome back. While you were gone, I've soldered the speed controllers to the power distribution board. So we're ready to move on. So next thing I'm going to do, while I have everything up and ready, is get a little bit more of the soldering done. So I'm going to pull out my LED. I'm going to pull out my XC60 connector, and I'm going to go ahead and also prep my video wires for my camera and for my video transmitter. So let me get going with that, and then it'll make a little less soldering later down the road. Alright, I soldered the wires onto the LED, plus the plus minus to minus. I'm going to mount the LED in the 3D printed mount. There's slots for it right here in the back. Okay. That's what it looks like when mounted. The wires go through the slot over there. I'm going to come over the top right here, and they're going to solder to the power distribution board, and we'll do that in a few minutes. Okay. Meanwhile, I'm going to take my video transmitter and do a couple things real quickly. Just clean up some of the plastic. So open up the dip switch panel so I can change channels, and also clean up the plastic that's covering the connector so I can more easily connect to them. Alright, when everything's said and done, the video transmitter is going to fit like so, with the wires going through the gap in the back. So in my case, I have two sets of wires. I have the signal and camera wire. It's two audios, the two white ones, a yellow one for video, and then power through the regulator to the camera. Now in my case, in my camera, I do not need regulated power, so I will go ahead and remove all of the wires off of here with the exception of the video wire. That's the only one I'm going to use. The second wire, which is this little short one, is power, and that one I'm basically going to measure out by placing this component where it's going to go and measuring the distance between the connector and the power distribution board where it's going to connect. Now I'm going to take auxiliary 2 right up there, and that's where I'm going to solder the power connector. So let me do that first. So to make my life easier, what I'm going to do next actually is I'm going to mount the two standoffs that go in the back. Now I like to Loctite the standoffs to the bottom of the frame, as the maintenance that I do typically revolves around the top of the frame. So I'll put Loctite on the bottom, I will not put Loctite on the top. So let me go ahead and do that next. Now that the standoffs are in position, I can go ahead and slide in this bottom mount. This bottom mount is ready to go. When I solder the power for the video transmitter to the power distribution board, I will also be soldering the LEDs at the same time. This will save me some work later. Now while I'm here, I'll connect this power wire too. It'll make it easier. It will make life easier later. Okay. So the LED and the video transmitter power are all set. This is nice, tucked in position. It's not going to go anywhere. Next, I'll move on to the actual power connector. When soldering a power connector, I always like to have the opposite plugged in. This way the pins won't move out of position. So, yeah, another use for my handy dandy little testing tool. Next big soldering we're going to do is we're going to connect the camera wire power to auxiliary 1 on the front here. So this wire comes with a servo plug on one end and a camera plug on the other side. Camera wire is pretty straightforward. We got yellow, which is video out, and then we have power. So I'm going to position my camera roughly where it's going to go on the quad. So there, more or less, doesn't have to be exact. Figure out how much wire I want. I want a little bit of slack. Now, what I'll do also is I'll cut the video wire to the same length, and I will then measure the video wire from the video transmitter to match that particular length in a second. Okay, so about here should be fine. Set the servo plug aside because I'm actually going to use it in a minute. Over here I'm only going to use one of these wires. And that's going to be the yellow one. So instead of cutting them all, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull the pins out and save them in case I change my mind and want to use one of them later. I'm lifting the pin with my X-Acto, lifting the little plastic tab with my X-Acto, and then pulling on the wire, and that should bring it right up. There's one. Now I'll set these aside. And decide what length do I need to cut the yellow wire. Now I grab the little spare piece of heat shrink that came with my motors, and I'm going to use that to cover the video wire here. Alright, I'll slide the video wire underneath and out on the other side. And finally plug it in. All that remains is when I mount the camera, just to plug in this wire down here. The video will be done. Okay, so as you can see from the power distribution board, I got 2 bits of soldering left to do, 5 volt here and power here. So let's get those done. Remember, I saved the connector from the video. Let me go ahead and figure out how I'm going to run this. Flip it over to the top to my flight controller. So about this much. I only need power and ground, so let me remove the yellow wire. And while I'm here, I'm going to make the connector smaller. There we go. Nice and clean. Now let's solder it to the power distribution board. So that connector went to the 5 volt pads on the power distribution there, right there where it says 5 volts. Okay, one left to go, power. So in order to solder the power connector, I want to pre-assemble everything because this is kind of a tight fit on purpose so that we can do one-handed plugging and unplugging of the connector. So let me go ahead, fit this in here. Close it up, and then we'll slide it down here in a second. Alright, solder the wires. Before I bring it all together, I want to install the antenna connector in here too. It's a little tight in there, but it fits. Now I'll just tighten the nut to get it all the way through. There she is, nice and tight. Slide in that middle piece, slide in the connector, press in the top piece for a receiver, slide it all down. Our rear stack is nice and tightly assembled now. What I like to do is I'll put a bolt in one of these posts temporarily just to hold everything in place. There you go, now it won't come apart. Okay, all we have left to do is mount the flight controller, mount the camera, connect everything up, and program our flight controller. So let's get going. So I'm going to be using the through lens mount plate. I'm going to take my camera and I'm going to mount it through there. So in order to do that, first thing I'm going to do is loosen the nut, keeping the lens roughly in the right position. We'll have to focus this later anyway, but I want to at least get it close. So I'll slide in this roughly where I want it. What I'm doing is I'm sliding the board in the gap, and this will tell me how much to back up the nut to get it fairly close. Now I can remove the lens. Place the lens through the carbon fiber panel. And then rethread the case, being extra careful that I don't cross thread it. Okay, now based on your camera, your lettering needs to be facing straight up and down, and you'll then have to tighten your lens, and eventually once you hook it up to a monitor to your goggles, you'll have to refocus the lens to make sure that it's right. But for now we'll just put it in this position. It's ready to go. We'll just slot it right there. Okay, connect the connector when we assemble the top plate. Before I do that, however, I got to get my flight controller ready, and that means that my flight controller needs some pins. So let me go find some pins so I can use on my flight controller. Okay, took a short break. We're getting a lot closer. All the soldering to the power distribution board is done. Most of my quad is assembled. I do have a few little things left to do. Primarily, I need to hook up my flight controller. So in the break, I went through and I pinned my flight controller, soldered a few pins there for the motors, there for the power, and in the back I have a pigtail with an S-bus inverter because I run S-bus connectivity. So the flight controller is ready. I've depinned and I heat shrunk my receiver. It's ready to be installed as well. Here's my S-bus out, and I'm going to go ahead and install all this. Before I do that, however, I'm going to take two of the little pigtails I cut off from my speed controllers, and I'm going to make a custom connector with them. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out the cables. Doing this exactly the same way I did the cables on the video connector. I lift the little tab carefully and I pull on the wire. I have two 3-position connectors. I'm going to cut them down to 2-position connectors, just like I did with the power wire connector out of my power distribution board. Now, I do want to be careful that I cut them on opposite ends. So if I'm going to cut one on the right hand side and one on the left hand side, because I want to make sure that I can then glue them together in the middle. After I cut them, a little cleanup with an X-Acto blade. One down, one to go. Okay, there they are cut. Now I'm just going to glue them together. Just like that, we have a 4-position servo connector. Next, we're going to go ahead and mount our flight controller to our quad. Now, the front of this flight controller actually happens to be over here, which means I would mount it, normally I would mount it this way. However, it'd be very hard for me to get access to the USB port if I mount it in that direct orientation, so I'm actually going to mount it in this particular orientation, off to the side over here. You'll see that I will feed the receiver pigtail out to the front, and that'll make it easier to hook up my receiver when I mount it. Okay, the flight controller is in position. Next I'm gonna put some nuts on it. The remaining nylon nuts that come with the nylon standoffs. There we go. Perfect fit. Wires and antennas have been fed. I use a little bit double stick tape to fix it to the tray. Alright, receiver is all set. Let's hook up power. And that leaves us only signal left to do. So here's what we're going to do with the signal. I'm going to go ahead and run my wires under the power distribution, under the flight controller, around to the front of the quad and up like this. Okay, I've trimmed them all to length. Next, I get to put pins on them. Now, I happen to have pins in the crimper, so I can just add pins to it. If you don't have pins in the crimper, that's fine too. You can leave the wires full length. Don't cut them originally, so keep them full length, right? And then just remove the connector out of the housing, and then just insert it here. Or, if you want to make them shorter, you can solder them up at the speed controller, so cut them at the opposite end, right? Or solder them in the middle. It's all your choice. To me, it's easier to crimp them. I do have the tool, so I'm going to go ahead and do that next. Okay, crimping is done. All connectors are on. Next, I need to position these properly. Now, I'll be running clean flight. So in my case, the motor ordering is 1, 2, 3, 4. If you're flying open flight or Libre pilot, it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4. So my pins go 1 all the way to the left. So this will be 1. Alright, pins are all in position. Only thing left to do is slide the connector in place. So my motors are now hooked up and I can start final assembly. So I'm going to go ahead and connect the camera first. Four remaining standoffs with Loctite. Alright, when you're done you'll have a camera plate left over, but that's by design. Finally, we're just going to put on the top plate. Okay. Before we do that, remove the existing bolt that we used to hold everything down, and then we'll just drive all 6 screws. Alright, a couple of things left to button up your build. If you like to use Velcro, a piece is supplied for you. You can run it right there. I like to put hook on my quad, loop on my battery. So there it is. Now you'll notice we provided 2 sets of battery straps for middle and back. Middle if you're only running your battery with no camera, that'll give you the right center of gravity. If you're going to run a camera up front, you can use these slots to strap it down. Obviously you can bolt to the bolts. We sell run cam mounts. We'll eventually sell GoPro mounts as well at thehobbymonster.com. And your strap goes through here for your camera. If you're going to run a camera, you'll run your battery strap in the back. If you're not going to run a camera, you'll run your battery strap in the front. You'll notice on the side of the top plate, there's a couple of nubs, one on each side. They're meant to get the center of gravity of your quad. If you hold it up by there, your quad should sit level. Okay? Finally, just a couple last little things to button up the quad. I'll insert my antenna straws. Get them exactly where I need them. One there. One there. And before I plug it in, even if it's just for configuration and calibration, don't forget to mount an antenna or you're prone to burn out your video transmitter. So I'll go ahead and do that now. I'll wrap up by configuring my flight controller, calibrating my speed controllers, making sure that everything's working the way it's supposed to, flash firmware, etc. And then when I'm ready, I'll put on the props and I'll go out and fly. Couple little tips: if you find that your camera mounting board is a little loose, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, depends on environmental factors and tolerances, just a little bit of hot glue at the junction will clean that up and make it nice and firm. Or alternately, you could put some rubber bands or fuel tubing as a bushing, and that'll accomplish the same thing. Other than that, one last recommendation before you fire everything up for the first time. Again, recommend using something like this to eliminate the possibility of you burning up any components. You could always go and double check all of your connections, make sure that everything is positive and negative is negative, and you're not going to blow anything up. And give it one final check before you plug it in. Anyway, thanks for watching. That's how you put together your Harpie. This was when we're ready to go. Let me go configure it.